Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 18936 in the name of Ben Macpherson on behalf of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee on SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons. I call on Ben Macpherson on behalf of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee to speak to and move the motion around 8 minutes. Mr Macpherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as convener of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee, I am pleased to open today's debate and I move the motion in my name. This strategic review was commissioned by the Parliament following the findings of the Finance and Public Administration Committee's inquiry into Scotland's Commissioner Landscape. That report recommended that a dedicated committee should be established to undertake a strategic view of the bodies supported by the SPCB and that it must report by June 2025. Parliament set us that objective and we delivered it. And today I am proud to present the unanimous key findings on behalf of the committee. I think this is a very good piece of work that was collaborative and that the Parliament can be proud of. Sure.
Order, Fraser.
I'm very grateful to the convener for giving way. Given the findings were unanimous and followed on from the unanimous findings of the Finance Committee, does he not agree with me that it is surprising that the Labour Party of today sought to amend the motion from the convener to take out our key recommendations?
Ben Macpherson.
I do, and I would urge Parliament not to support the amendment, and I will say more about that in due course. Before I turn to the detail of our deliberations and conclusions, I also want to place on record my sincere thanks to all of those who contributed to our review. First of all, to my MSP colleagues from different parties. I think we worked very well, effectively and collegiately and got a good piece of work done. And that was also thanks to our clerks who supported us very well through the process. Thank you also to all those who gave evidence, whether through oral or written evidence in terms of submissions. The insights we received were invaluable. Your time and expertise helped us shape the recommendations we present to Parliament today. Over the course of the 6 months, our committee gathered extensive evidence from a wide range of contributors, including current SPCB-supported bodies, academics, researchers, Scottish Government bodies, the Minister for Public Finance and the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. Taken as a package, our conclusions and recommendations create a clear strategic framework and aim to establish a formalised process for assessing future proposals to create new SPCB-supported bodies, strengthen mechanisms for accountability and scrutiny, enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of shared services, and potentially change the remits and powers of some existing bodies. I'll say more about this later. Consistent with the conclusions reached by the Finance and Public Administration Committee, our committee agrees that the existing SPCB-supported bodies play a vital role in safeguarding public trust, institutional integrity and democratic accountability. We heard how they deliver their core functions and saw in person how their offices are adapted to suit the needs of users, such as the Children's Commissioner's office being a bright and welcoming place for children. Each body was created by this Parliament in response to a perceived need, and collectively they contribute to the strength and health of our democratic landscape. The work they do matters and it makes a difference. However, the evidence we received also highlighted a key concern that the existing landscape has developed in an ad hoc manner, with individual bodies having varying functions and powers. This has resulted in a collection of bodies with distinct and at times overlapping functions operating under different legislative frameworks.
John Mason.
I thank Ben Macpherson for giving way. He talks about the existing landscape, but does he not accept that for most people having a Standards Commission and a Commissioner for Ethical Standards is totally confusing and unnecessary?
Ben Macpherson.
I can see in some ways why members and others may look at that distinction between the two bodies critically. However, we did actually hear quite good evidence, and I would refer the member to the evidence we heard about the benefits of those two bodies being separate and distinct. When our committee was established, there were proposals for up to 5 new SPCB-supported bodies with advocacy functions to be created before the end of this parliamentary session. As set out in the motion for today's debate, we are concerned that such expansion risks further fragmenting the existing landscape, increasing complexity for service users, and placing additional strain on the SPCB and committee resources. Therefore, I urge Parliament to reject the amendment if it is moved. Based on the evidence we received, we are clear in our view as a committee, unanimously, that the SPCB supported body landscape should not be expanded to include new advocacy-type bodies. While we understand the benefit in organisations with a public trust element, such as the Ethical Standards Commissioner or Scottish Information Commissioner, being SPCB-supported bodies, we believe that advocacy bodies, where required, could just as effectively sit within the wider public sector landscape. Of course, we do accept that there may be future occasions when the establishment of a new SPCB-supported body is justified, but a clear need must be demonstrated. That is why we have recommended implementation of a two-tier criteria comprising justification and effectiveness tests that must be satisfied before any new proposal can be brought forward. The four justification criteria will be, namely, 1. Last resort, in the alternative model, such as enhanced powers to existing public sector bodies or statutory duties on ministers, must be exhausted and deemed insufficient to address the issue. 2. Functional gap. There must be clear, evidenced and persistent absence of the proposed body's functional gap across the Scottish public sector landscape, not just within SPCB-supported bodies. 3. Permanent. The proposed body must address an issue in perpetuity. It cannot be created to deal with an issue that might have arisen due to a short-term failure or perceived failure in public service, of which could be resolved with a fixed-term dedicated piece of work by an existing body. And 4. Independence. The proposed body must require a high degree of operational and perceived independence from the Scottish Government. And the committee welcomes the Scottish Government's commitment to explore incorporating these criteria into its own ministerial control framework for new public bodies. Turning now to governance and accountability of SPCB-supported bodies, which operates in two broad streams. Firstly, the SPCB, which is responsible for governance and resourcing, including oversight of budgets, staffing and accommodation. And secondly, parliamentary committees responsible for holding SPCB-supported bodies to account in the exercise of their functions. Both our review and that of the Finance and Public Administration Committee identified a core challenge: capacity. The governance and scrutiny of these bodies has been limited, not due to a lack of willingness, but due to the finite time and resource available to the SPCB and to committees of this Parliament. Therefore, our view is that solely recommending that the SPCB or parliamentary committees do more would not in itself bring about the improvements that are required, especially appreciating the amount of legislation that recently committees have had to deal with, and we should all consider that in terms of the next parliamentary term. I can, yes.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Ben Macpherson giving way on that point, and only yesterday we brought into existence the Victim and Witnesses Commissioner, in which in that legislation there is a direct power upon the Commissioner to impose a response to its annual report. Was that something that the committee considered as a way of ensuring it?
Ben Macpherson, I'll give you the time back for the interventions.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and thank you to Martin Whitfield for constructive intervention. The processes that were being put forward in terms of both in government bills and in members' bills was obviously an issue that the committee took into consideration. The Victims Commissioner that was established through the passing of the legislation yesterday was well advanced when our committee began its remits, and that obviously was a factor in the considerations. And I'm happy to follow up on the point you raised later on in the debate, if that's helpful. While we acknowledge the adaptability of SPCB members to give effect to the will of Parliament and put in place oversight mechanisms, we do not believe that this can be sustained without diminishing other core functions of the SPCB. So by reviewing alternative models both in the UK and internationally, we have concluded that a parliamentary committee should be given specific responsibility for the accountability and scrutiny of SPCB-supported bodies for a fixed period as a pilot in Session 7. We do not make this recommendation lightly, and we understand that the existing capacity issues for MSPs and parliamentary committees are significant. However, we firmly believe that a single committee with accountability and scrutiny functions for all the SPCB-supported bodies is absolutely necessary to enhance effectiveness and delivery of outcomes. In response to our report, the SPCB acknowledge many of the complexities we identified with this recommendation. We welcome its positive commitment to work with the Parliamentary Committee and officials to explore what would be desirable within the broader constitutional framework, and if so, how that can be achieved. In closing, I would like to thank the Minister for Public Finance and members of the SPCB for their positive responses to the committee's conclusions and recommendations. Members will see from the report that we have also recommended a series of targeted improvements that could be made to improve how the SPCB-supported body landscape and indeed the wider public sector operates. I will cover them in more detail when concluding today's debate. The committee is confident that our conclusions and recommendations will create a clear strategic framework for the SPCB-supported body landscape, and I urge all members to support the committee's motion unamended.
Thank you, Mr McPherson. I now call on Sarah Boyack to speak to and move Amendment 18936.1 in the name of Martin Whitfield. Around 6 minutes. Ms Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think the committee's report is a must-read for all MSPs. And I want to start by moving our Labour amendment because we want to welcome and note the report and to recognise the range of recommendations that have been made on new and existing commissioners, on governance and accountability, on budget and audit issues and on shared services. The problem we had is that on the one hand, the SPCB body language shouldn't be expanded to include new advocacy type supported bodies, and then it sets out that new bodies should meet the justification and criteria test set out in paragraph 150. So the key issue has to be the justification and criteria test, which should be used when the relevant parliamentary committee is considering proposals for a new commissioner. I've followed the committee's work both because it addresses a really important issue of the growing landscape of commissioners and because I've been working this term on my own member's bill, which is focused on accountability, coherence in public bodies in relation to wellbeing and sustainable development, and ensuring that the Scottish Government, our councils and the wider public sector are held to account for their impact now and in the future. And if I can quote John Swinney from his speech today, he referenced George Reid's call for a sense of purpose, because today is tomorrow. And last year I brought forward a debate recognising the UN's Declaration of Future Generations and argued then that one of the most important things we can do is to think about how we build a society when people's well-being and sustainable development are built into policy, actions and spending decisions by all of our government and public sector bodies in Scotland. But to deliver those principles, we need clear guidance, accountability and a focus ensuring they're actually delivered, not just warm words, hence my proposal for an investigator powers for the Commissioner. Now, the report we're debating references proposals for new commissioners and describes them as advocacy commissioners, something I don't agree with in relation to my proposed commissioner, which I was clear about in my evidence to the committee. And Martin Whitfield acknowledged that we established a new commissioner for victims and witnesses yesterday, and that again was listed as an advocacy commissioner. And there have been questions about whether the powers of the new commissioner are actually sufficient. So I'm really glad, I want to say this, that the committee acknowledges the positive contribution that's been made by existing commissioners and that they fulfil a vital function in safeguarding public trust, institutional integrity and democratic accountability. And although the report notes some overlap, they said that the evidence was that each of the SPCB supported bodies provide a unique and necessary contribution. And I won't, because I'm very tight, I think. If I have time later. I think the recommendations about induction and training for the next session in Parliament are important because all new MSPs and their staff need to be aware of the work and the remits of existing SPCB-supported bodies. We should maybe send the official report from today around to all our current colleagues because we've got to get interest in this. And the recommendation that a parliamentary committee should be given specific responsibility for accountability and scrutiny of SPCB-supported bodies for a fixed period as a pilot in Session 7, I think is really important. It will be an additional commitment for already overstretched capacity of the SPCB and our parliamentary committees. But I think the committee is clear that it's an ongoing issue that's not going away. But if we're to deliver parliamentary accountability, it's absolutely critical to the effectiveness of how we work as a democracy. And the pilot referenced in the motion talks about clearly referenced metrics. What does accountability mean? How will we judge effectiveness in the scrutiny? And what timescale for feedback to Parliament for public reporting? And it will be critical that voices of service users, children, young people, marginalised individuals, or those most affected by failures of oversight, but not regularly enabled to be consulted by us, and geographically inclusive too, critical. And I think in relation to the criteria for establishing new bodies, making the most of efficient resources is absolutely key. And that's why I very much support the hub and spoke model and using existing public sector office space to make sure that we get the effectiveness that's needed. And that aligns very well with the work I've been doing on my Members' Bill. In conclusion, this report makes an important and timely contribution to the ongoing efforts to make sure that our public sector operates with greater coherence, transparency and long-term accountability. We do need to avoid duplication. It was an issue I looked at in my bill and spoke to the Auditor-General. Clarity of roles is key, and memorandum of understanding is a good way to avoid overlap. So there's work we could do. So I urge the Parliament to agree to our Scottish Labour amendment, because we think that proceeding with the recommendations of the committee, having clear metrics with the Oversight Pilot Committee next session, and resourcing necessary to make it a success is absolutely vital. So let's seize this moment, not just to tidy up structures, but to make institutions and decision-making fit for the future, transparent, effective and trusted.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. Just to advise the Chamber, we have a little bit of time in hand, so members will get the time back, I would imagine, for any interventions. With that, I call Maggie Chapman on behalf of the SPCB. Around 6 minutes, Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm speaking today as a member of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, and I'd like to begin by thanking the committee for undertaking this inquiry. This work and the inquiry undertaken by the Finance and Public Administration Committee has understandably been unsettling for the current office holders, and the SPCB appreciates the acknowledgement of this in the committee's report. We also welcome the committee's recognition that the bodies currently supported by the SPCB carry out vital functions. The corporate body notes the committee's conclusions relating to advocacy-type SPCB-supported bodies. I have mentioned this in a previous debate, but I want to be clear that the SPCB does not take a view on whether a new office holder should be established. That is rightly for the Parliament to determine. The SPCB has a statutory duty to support independent office holders. This duty has become increasingly time-consuming since 2003, during which time the number of office holders has increased from 2 to 8. The mention of proposals for up to an additional 6 new office holders has understandably caused concern for the corporate body, and we raised this with both Scottish ministers and the Finance and Public Administration Committee. The corporate body therefore welcomes the committee's work and the overall approach to create a clear strategic framework. We welcome the acknowledgement that additional office holders would have an impact on the corporate body and other parliamentary resources. The role of the SPCB extends far beyond agreeing annual funding for the office holders, and additional office holders would affect our workload, our overall budget, and the workload of the officials in office holder services. Yes.
Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Maggie Chapman on behalf of the SPCB taking an intervention. Is there concern at the SPCB level that, in particular, a new committee to, in effect, apply this 2 tests for a new commissioner would consequently require the SPCB to give evidence to that committee as to the impact of it? And are the SPCB comfortable with doing that?
Maggie Chapman.
I thank Martin Whitfield for that intervention. I'll come on to say a little bit more about that potential new committee in a moment. And I suppose what corporate body wants to ensure is that the office holder landscape is coherent and strategic, and at the moment we are clear it is not. So if that committee establishes that coherence and strategic approach, then that is something we would be very willing to work with. Yes.
McPherson.
I thank Maggie Chapman for taking the initiative. Just as a point of clarity, I think it's worth emphasising that the committee's recommendations were not necessarily that a new committee should be established. That was a potential option, but an existing committee could take on the task of assessing the SPCB supported bodies. I just think that's important to acknowledge.
Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Ben McPherson for his intervention. Yes, that is understood. That is why I couched my comments. Should that committee be established? But even if it is not, and those responsibilities lie elsewhere, corporate body will obviously work with that committee to make sure it works as smoothly as it can. I will now turn to specific recommendations within the committee's report, starting with the new set of criteria developed by the committee. The corporate body is very supportive of the criteria and the strong message it sends on shared services. Should the Parliament endorse this recommendation and the recommendations relating to the inclusion of the criteria in parliamentary guidance on bills and a standing order determination, officials will be asked to bring forward proposals as to how these recommendations can be implemented. The corporate body notes the recommendations relating to existing SPCB supported bodies. Again, should these recommendations be endorsed by the Parliament, we will work with relevant office holders and the Scottish Government as appropriate to implement them. As the committee acknowledges, these proposals will require additional resources, which will be an important consideration given the wider public finance context. To ensure we undertake our role properly, we have put a number of governance arrangements in place, but we note the deficiencies identified by both the FPAC and SSBLR committees in the governance and accountability of corporate body supported bodies. Additional work in this area would require the SPCB's approach to all of its work to be reviewed to ensure we fulfilled all of our responsibilities, but we will, of course, always give effect to the will of the Parliament. I want to speak directly regarding the recommendations at paragraphs 158 to 161, that a parliamentary committee is given the specific responsibility for the accountability and scrutiny of corporate body supported bodies. To be clear, the remits and establishments of committees is not a matter for the corporate body. Furthermore, SPCB is aware of the SPPA Committee's inquiry into committee effectiveness, including what changes can be made to strengthen committees' ability to undertake scrutiny work across a range of policy areas. The corporate body is conscious that there are several pressures in the system and that a new committee structure for Session 7 will need to balance these demands alongside capacity constraints, including member and SPS resources. The corporate body is also mindful that its statutory functions, duties and responsibilities are set out within the broader constitutional landscape. Should the recommendation at paragraph 160 be endorsed by the Parliament, the SPCB will commit to collaborating on whether the delegation or transfer of SPCB functions would be desirable within this framework, and if so, how that can be achieved. As the committee acknowledges, this will require legislative change, given that various acts mention the corporate body specifically in relation to a range of functions. We will therefore ask officials to undertake a mapping exercise prior to Session 7 to clearly set out functions for each body, the statutory basis for these functions, and what the options for change would look like. If the recommendation at paragraph 161 is endorsed, we will commit to exploring how to improve operational oversight of office holders in the context of the Session 7 committee structure. I will comment briefly on the amendment, but only to say that, as ever, the SPCB will seek to implement the will of Parliament. Parliament should be clear that, if the amendment is passed, then there will not be the basis for the SPCB to take the steps I have outlined above. I repeat that it is for Parliament to take that decision, but it is important that Parliament is clear on what the implications of that decision are. Before I move on to shared services, I will briefly comment on the budget and audit recommendations. I'd like to highlight the ongoing review of the public audit model by the Auditor-General and the Accounts Commission, and note the corporate body will engage with that review. I also highlight the corporate body's agreement with the committee's view that medium to long-term financial planning is not hindered by an annual budget and funding cycle. Finally, moving on to the recommendations relating to shared services, the corporate body welcomes the committee's acknowledgement of the improvements in this area. 5 office holders are now co-located at Bridgeside House, with a Patient Safety Commissioner for Scotland having taken up post on the 1st of September. This co-location has resulted in further accommodation savings. The corporate body welcomes the recommendation relating to a hub-and-spoke model and will work with office holders to implement it as opportunities to do so arise. In related work, the corporate body recently established an accommodation audit in relation to office holders, and through that process is looking at the use of the wider public sector estate. As such, we welcome the committee's recommendation in this area. To conclude, I thank again all of the office holders for their dedicated work, and I thank the committee too for its report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call on Kenneth Gibson to open on behalf of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to speak on behalf of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. As members know, the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee was established by Parliament in response to the FPA Committee's own inquiry report on Scotland's Commissioner Landscape, a strategic approach, published on 16 September last year. Now, 1 year on, we see the culmination of a comprehensive piece of work by the two committees, and I pay tribute to Ben McPherson and his team for completing the report by June of this year, as requested by the FPA Committee. My colleagues and our excellent clerking team, roared on by the SPCB, also put in a huge amount of work in preparing our initial report, and I thank them for that. I'm confident this work will bring real and substantive change in creating a more strategic and coherent Commissioner landscape fit for the future. I'd like to revisit some of the concerns that prompted our inquiry back in December 2023 and how we approached our work and arrived at our findings. I'll also reflect on the Review Committee's report, which the FPA Committee unanimously endorses. Our own inquiry followed concerns that a growing number of proposals to create advocacy or rights-based commissioners could lead to the SPCB-supported body landscape almost doubling in size by the end of this Parliament. This, of course, would have significant implications for the SPCB and overall Scottish Parliament budget. The committee wanted to establish the extent to which a more coherent and strategic approach to creating and developing SPCB-supported bodies was needed and, if so, how this might be achieved. We therefore sought to establish how the model was working in practice and the drivers for the increased number of proposals to create new commissioners. Possible alternative models were also considered, as was the case for review. We found the experiences and frustration with public service delivery failures are reasons given for supporting the establishment of new advocacy or rights-based SPCB-supported bodies. Others felt the need for a champion to represent particular groups in society who may feel overlooked. There was strong evidence of overlap and duplication among commissioners in the wider public sector and of accountability and scrutiny mechanisms found wanting. Interestingly, former Labour and SNP MSPs David Stewart and Alex Neil in evidence both said that having pursued commissioners in the last Parliament, they no longer considered it the best way forward. The FPA Committee therefore unanimously concluded it was time to pause and take stock before any new bodies were added to an already complex and disjointed landscape. We therefore asked Parliament to agree to a root and branch review carried out by a dedicated committee, similar to the review of SPCB-supported bodies committee set up in 2008. The purpose was to design a clear, strategic framework to underpin and provide more coherence and structure to the landscape. It would also aim to enable more effective accountability and scrutiny mechanisms, improve delivery of outcomes and value for money. We are grateful to Parliament for establishing the Review Committee and agreeing to a moratorium on creating any new SPCB-supported bodies or expanding the remits of existing bodies while the review is underway. The FPA Committee is pleased the Review Committee built on the evidence we received, with its report echoing many of our findings. It is also important that in doing so, as previously touched on, it met the ambitious reporting timescale of June this year, showing us all, including government, that it is possible to produce excellent work within set deadlines. Regarding the Review Committee's key findings, the SPCB-supported body landscape should not be expanded to include new advocacy-type commissioners. Indeed, the FPA's committee's own report concluded that this trend is not sustainable and that, and I quote, "This advocacy role is for MSPs to undertake, with Parliament holding government to account and how it seeks to improve the lives of specific groups of society or develop and deliver effective policy, with the third sector continuing to play a crucial role." We also felt that funding for new supported bodies would be better spent on improving public service delivery on the ground, where greater impact can be made. Recommendations to enhance and formalise criteria for creating new SPCB-supported bodies, including that this must only happen as a last resort when all other models and approaches are exhausted. The view that a parliamentary committee is given the specific responsibility for the accountability and scrutiny of SPC-supported bodies for a fixed period of time, it's a pilot exercise, is a sound one. It's clear that the current model of governance and scrutiny is not working, and it's time to try something new next session. As a committee responsible for public service reform, we share the Review Committee's view that SPCB-supported bodies could and should do more to adopt a more proactive and preventative approach. We wholeheartedly agree that this approach will not only enhance the effectiveness of these bodies, but also help avoid failures in public service delivery and complaints happening in the first place. Many of the recommendations could as easily apply to the wider public sector, such as the sharing of services and offices. We therefore welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to carry out, as part of its reform programme, a strategic mapping exercise to identify the functions of all Scottish public bodies and where they overlap. The Review Committee rightly points out that this will help inform decisions on future size, structure and coherence across the public sector. Now, given the unanimity on both committees, Labour amendment is deeply disappointing. Martin Whitfield circulated a paper some months ago calling for parliamentary committees to be respected and strengthened, yet he now calls on Parliament to ignore, no doubt for cynical reasons of internal party management, the unanimous view of two committees following 2 years of hard work. That is shameful. I'm happy to take an intervention from the defender of the committee structures.
I have great respect for Kenneth Gibson, but I find the articulation of his comment about an amendment to a motion, albeit on the back of a committee debate, which I must say was of course occasioned by the departure of this session from the usual standards for committee motions to be noted, a tad disappointing. I am saddened by it. If we are not prepared to debate, if we are not prepared to analyse, if we are not prepared to discuss here the extent to which we wish to bind a future Parliament, then I think we do both this chamber and the future chamber a disservice. I've welcomed, and will do in my speech, my apologies for the length, Deputy Presiding Officer, all of the submissions that we've heard here today, and I'm more than happy to prepare to answer them and to respond to them, and indeed to debate them, and I'm more than happy to do that with the member.
Give your time back, Kenneth Gibson.
Desperate stuff. If the colleague next to you hadn't got her own proposal to bring forward a commissioner, I doubt we'd be having this debate. Let's be honest about it. The Labour colleagues on both the Finance Committee and the Review supported the unanimous decision. Now, in days gone by, some MSPs may have looked to have the legacy of a bill in their name. Now it appears to be a commissioner. We must see the bigger picture. Presiding Officer, the FPA Committee thanks the SPCB-supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee for carrying out this important piece of work and encourages all members to support its motion at decision time today.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. I now call on Minister Ivan McKee. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And first, I'd like to welcome the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee's report and recommendations on how the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body Supported Bodies Landscape can be improved. It's a long title, but it's an important topic, and I want to come on and talk about the wider context of that on reflection to the wider public service reform agenda the Government's taken forward. I was pleased to be able to give evidence to the committee earlier this year, and I've already set out the Government's position in regard to the committee's report in my written response on the 9th of September. I'd like to reiterate that today and offer any clarification as required, and also thank everyone for their work and contributions to the committee's report. At the heart of the committee's report is a desire to see efficient delivery of public services, very much aligned with the Government's own public service reform ambitions. I recognise the committee's interest in reform of the public bodies landscape, and the Government accepts its recommendations that the Scottish Government undertakes a strategic mapping exercise to identify the functions of all Scottish public bodies, not just those that are SPCB supported, and where they overlap. And I'm pleased to confirm with the committee and Parliament that this work is already underway and will be completed as part of Workstream 4 of the Public Service Reform Strategy, which I published on 19th June this year. That strategy identifies how public bodies can deliver services more efficiently and effectively, building on the principles set out in the Christie Commission on the delivery of public services. The review of public body functions will address the committee's recommendations and inform decisions on future size, structure and coherence across the wider public sector. Indeed.
Stephen Kerr.
I'm grateful to the Minister for giving me. Just for clarity, when did he say the deadline
for that work would be? Bearing in mind the comments from Kenny Gibson about a deadline helps get things delivered.
Minister.
No, he's absolutely right, and the member should be aware there's 18 work streams across the PSR strategy we've spent the summer putting together the teams that are going to lead each of those work streams, and the action plan for that work stream 4, along with the other 17 work plans, will be published very, very shortly, so the member can see the deadlines and the work plan that's been taken forward as part of that. Reforming Scotland's public services is vital to ensure people experience high-quality services focused on those who need it most. However, government involvement in reviewing the parliamentary commissioner landscape is by its nature constrained and at times inappropriate due to the nature of the services these bodies deliver and their independence from government. I appreciate that the committee's review and report was born out of concerns around an expanding commissioner landscape and what that could mean for public finance and effective service delivery. SPCB supported office holders budgeted £18.3 million for the year 24-25, and that is set to rise following the introduction of the new Patient Safety Commissioner for Scotland. Of course, this needs to be set in the wider context of the around £5 billion corporate cost spend across the Scottish public body and Scottish Government landscape. Indeed.
John Mason.
I take the Minister's point, and he's said it before, and he's absolutely right, that this is a relatively small amount of money in the scheme of things. But would you accept that this sends a signal out? If we can control the commissioners, perhaps we can control the number of other public bodies?
Minister.
I think John Mason makes that point very well, and I think when I recognised at the start of my contribution that this debate has a much wider significance across the public service reform agenda, and the importance of delivering on this, albeit small part of it, does send a very strong signal regarding the wider landscape. So regarding those public bodies more widely, the Scottish Government's PSR programme is focused on driving a culture of continuous improvement to support efficiency and effectiveness across the delivery of public services. And I'm delighted to see the committee's recommendations align with those intentions. Particularly pleased to see the committee's recommended criteria for the establishment of any new SPCB-supported bodies. As Parliament is aware, any Scottish Government proposal to establish a new body must follow strictly the ministerial control framework, which ensures a rigorous best value process where a public body to be deemed necessary, and only after all alternative delivery options had been explored. Where this concerns the potential creation of a new SPCB-supported body, the Ministerial Control Framework Guidance stresses that the merits of that decision must be discussed with the Chief Executive's Office of the SPCB at the earliest opportunity. The committee's proposed two-tier justification criteria for the establishment of SPCB-supported bodies reflects the terms of that control framework, and my officials will look to update the control framework in line with the committee's recommendations, should Parliament accept them this afternoon. I also recognise the committee's recommendation that no new advocacy-type bodies are established, and we agree with this general principle, as I've set out in my written response to the committee. As the committee heard during evidence sessions, advocacy-type roles in other instances may be more appropriate for MSPs, for government or for other public sector organisations to fulfil. I also said in my written response, government officials remain on hand to support any future reform of the SPCB-supported public body landscape where it's appropriate to do so. In matters relating to concerning the powers and remit of the Scottish Human Rights Commission and Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, I'd like to highlight the Scottish Government has recently published a discussion paper which sets out its proposals in relation to a proposed human rights bill. This paper sets out a range of options for the SHRC and the SPSO that are intended to strengthen their ability to provide accountability and support for human rights in Scotland. Government officials will
Briefly, Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Simon McKee to take an intervention on that point. And with the concept of the future Human Rights Commissioner, will the Scottish Government indeed follow the process that it's done with the Victims and Witnesses Commissioner and build into the legislation the requirement to respond to that individual, both with regard to their annual report, but with regard to
Minister,
other
and please bring your remarks to close when responding.
We'll take that into account as we move forward. Government officials will continue to engage in relation to that bill's proposals. I'd like to offer my reassurance to Parliament that will be available for discussion on further reform. Turning briefly to the issue of shared services, the Single Scottish Estate Programme is well underway. It's part of the wider PSR umbrella. The programme has already reduced the size, cost and emissions of the public sector estate. An overall total of £41 million of benefits have already been secured, well on our way to achieving the initial target of £50 to £80 million of benefit. I'm happy to discuss any of these issues further and look forward to hearing what others have to say during the debate this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Murdo Fraser to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, it's a pleasure to speak in this debate, both as a member of the committee and on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. And let me at the outset echo what the convener had to say in his thanks to the excellent team of committee clerks who supported us and the SPICE researchers who helped our work, and also thank all those who gave evidence in what was a relatively short and focused inquiry. And can I also pay tribute to the convener, Ben McPherson, for steering us so well throughout the process, and also to my fellow committee members. This was a small committee of just 5 MSPs, all from different parties, and yet I believe we worked together very well, with actually very little disagreement. And when this Parliament is considering its future make-up and approach to committees, I think we should reflect how successful a small committee has been and the good use it can make of the time available. And perhaps that's a pattern that we should consider in this Parliament for the future. And we were able to reach unanimous conclusions in a report based on the evidence that we had all heard. And on that point of being unanimous, I do think it's disappointing, and I would say this gently to Martin Whitfield. We had on our committee a Labour member, who in fact is with us today, Richard Leonard, who agreed with all our conclusions. We had, of course, in the Finance and Public Administration Committee, whose report we were following on from, equally unanimous conclusions, also with a Labour member. And I'm a bit surprised and disappointed that today the Labour Party doesn't seem to be agreeing to the conclusions that their members on both those committees were prepared to sign up to. Yes, of course.
Martin Whitfield.
I'm very grateful to Murdo Fraser for taking the intervention. And on a higher level, I would say we could disband with this chamber if we just get unanimity on committees. But I'm not particularly attracted by that, and nor will he be. There is an obligation to debate, there is an obligation to express, there is an obligation to investigate the proposals. And the amendment that was brought in my name on behalf of Scottish Labour intends to do that because of concerns I have about the wording of the motion.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, we'll look forward to Mr Whitfield and his colleagues' contributions, or indeed Mr Leonard's, if he's going to contribute, to see whether he's changed his mind since he sat on the committee. But I would just gently point out that there were... he's shaking his head, Presiding Officer. But it was clear that Labour representatives on not just one but 2 parliamentary committees were happy to sign up to recommendations. So clearly Labour have had a rethink. So no doubt that will be explained. So... as we were told by the convener, the committee was set up following a recommendation from the Finance and Public Administration Committee, who had already raised their concerns about proposals coming forward to create new commissioner bodies. And their conclusion was, and this is a quote, "Continuing the trend for creating new advocacy-type SPCB supported bodies is not sustainable." And they sought a new structure and set of guidelines. And that was the task given to our committee to consider. Now, one point which was very much in the forefront of our minds when we started considering these issues is that there are different types of commissioner. There are those that have essentially a regulatory, or primarily a regulatory function, such as the Ethical Standards Commissioner, SPSO, the Information Commissioner. And there are others that perform essentially or primarily advocacy roles. For example, the Children's Commissioner, although that Commissioner also has regulatory functions. And the committee's general view was that, of course, there is a place for those commissioners dealing primarily with regulation, although we did consider whether there might be some consolidation of those. And having considered that, we came to the view that we did not see significant opportunities in that space. But we did acknowledge that there might be the need for new commissioners in the future to deal with regulation in matters that we cannot currently foresee. So, for example, the creation of the Biometrics Commissioner was a relatively new office which was set up, which would not have been in contemplation, for example, when this Parliament was formed, because these matters were not regarded as significant at that point. But the committee had to draw a distinction between those commissioners and those who were being proposed purely or mainly in an advocacy role. And I should say we were entirely sympathetic to the members, some of whom are here today, who are bringing forward currently members' bills to create new commissioners in an advocacy role. And this reflects what is perceived to be failures in the delivery of public services for particular groups. And the question the committee had to wrestle with is whether introducing these new commissioners, with all the expense of setting up their bodies, is the best way to address these gaps in provision. Scotland is not an under-governed country. We have 129 MSPs, we have 56 MPs, we have 32 local authorities, over 1,000 local councillors, and a plethora of public organisations, from health boards to quangos. And if there are failures in public services, the answer is not, in my mind, to create yet another set of public appointees to try and address the problem. The answer, surely, is to try and address that problem at source and better enable all the people who are currently paid and in a position to try and solve those problems and make sure individuals are getting a fair deal. So the committee came to the conclusion that the creation of new advocacy commissioners, while the calls for these are perfectly understandable, is not something that represents good value for the public purse. And while this wasn't our primary consideration, the issue of public expenditure is important here, because commissioners cost money. And there is a risk of mission creep. There is a risk that once commissioners are established, they seek to expand their functions, expand their offices, and demand more and more cash. And we need to be conscious of that in the constrained times that we are with the public finances. And I was very struck when the Minister gave evidence to the committee. And I asked the Minister the question, what does he as Minister regard as having the most impact to it? Is it a report from a Commissioner? Is it a report, for example, from a cross-party committee of this Parliament or some external body? His answer, if I remember him rightly, was they were all one voice amongst others. So that the impact of the Commissioner's report is not any more significant than that, for example, of a parliamentary committee. And I think that was a very significant piece of evidence. Now, Presiding Officer, I know the committee's conclusions will be a disappointment to those out with this Parliament who are campaigning for new commissioners, and also to some MSPs, but resources are finite. And if we accept the case for new advocacy commissioners, there is an almost limitless number of new commissioners who one could argue for who should be appointed. And when we took evidence from Jeremy Balfour, who's not with us today, but Jeremy Balfour, who's proposing a new commissioner for the disabled, about this, he said, well, I accept that argument, but why pull up the drawbridge now? And to me, that rather misses the point with respect to Mr Balfour, because we don't actually have any pure advocacy commissioners right now, apart possibly from the Children's Commissioner, and you could argue that children are in a different category to others because children don't have votes and therefore don't have that direct voice in the democratic process that other groups do, for example. So, Presiding Officer, just to conclude, it's for those reasons we came to the conclusions we did in relation to the creation of new commissioners. I don't have time to discuss all the other points that we discussed about the need for improved accountability and scrutiny of assistant commissioners, the need for a dedicated committee, not necessarily a stand-alone committee, but a dedicated committee of this Parliament to scrutinise the work of commissioners. That's all covered in our detailed report that I would commend to members and the convener's motion today, which I'm very pleased to support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Fraser. I now call Lorna Slater to up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It was a privilege to be a member of the SPCB supported body's Landscape Review Committee, and I'd like to thank the convener and our excellent clerking and research team for their work. It was a genuinely interesting and productive committee. Over the course of several months, we were able to take a great deal of evidence, dig into the issues raised in some level of depth. We compared what we do in Scotland to how other countries manage those bodies who are responsible for maintaining trust in public life. I support the motion as brought by the committee convener, and I commend the paper to you all. Among the things that we explored as a committee were the reasons behind the sudden expansion and proposed expansion of the SPCB-supported bodies, particularly the requests for advocacy commissioners. As a committee, we found that there were 3 reasons for this. First, these commissioners were and are being requested in response to perceived failings in public services as a reaction, and creating a commissioner is a tangible and visible action that can be taken. Secondly, there is both the political kudos that a member may achieve by campaigning and achieving a commissioner, and the political difficulty of other politicians voting against or speaking against something that we all want: better public services for disadvantaged people, victims, patients and so on. And thirdly, there has been a lack of attention and adherence to already existing guidelines on the creation of new SPCB-supported bodies and commissioners. These guidelines have existed for a while, but both members proposing bills and the government have ignored them. It is understandable that when there is a failure or perceived failure in public services, that we want to see something being done to address the failure and prevent it in the future. But is a new commissioner the right answer? The committee heard that commissioners have no additional sway or influence on government than what members of parliament or third sector organisations have. When we asked a colleague from New Zealand about who held their government to account and advocated for the needs of disabled people, victims of crime, patients and so on, the answer was that they expect members of parliament to do that. We also heard concerns in our evidence that putting in place commissioners may be letting the government off the hook. Certainly, go ahead.
Sarah Boyack.
Yeah, I just want to ask the member. So we have fantastic advocacy groups. Stop Climate Chaos were lobbying us all today. Is it those groups or us as individuals that the member thinks should be carrying out guidance and investigations into either the government, individual local authorities or the 131 public sector bodies?
Lorna Slater.
I understand the point that the member is making, which is that there do need to be resources put into, into sort of investigations and guidance. There is a whole civil service for that. It is up to us to push the government to do these things, because the evidence is that it doesn't matter whether it's parliamentarians, third sector organisations, commissioners who are pushing for this work to get done. It won't get done unless the government takes it up. So it's about being effective. There is no evidence that commissioners have any more sway, because we can see commissioners creating report after report after report and them getting ignored in the same way that parliamentarians sometimes get ignored when we ask for specific actions, say on climate. So creating more commissioners who are just going to be ignored by government is not a solution at all. Creating a commissioner as a substitute for real action, a way to say that the government is taking a matter seriously, but actually being able to distance themselves from delivery and delay action, waiting for the Commission to report, waiting for the Commission to suggest something. My colleague Maggie Chapman proposed an excellent alternative for dealing with failures when they may arise. Rather than standalone commissioners, there could be focused periods of work to address the issue. She said, if we ask whether a dedicated piece of work should be done in the next 5 years by a body within the Scottish Human Rights Commission that essentially creates a sunset clause. This would be a mechanism to bring resources and attention to a specific area of concern without creating a whole new public body of questionable effectiveness that will last in perpetuity. The systems that we set up to support trust in public services and organisations should be designed to be proactive in finding problems and failures before they become serious, and not just reacting when things have gone wrong. We heard from the Ombudsman about the limitations to their remit that prevent them from undertaking proactive investigations, such as might prevent public service failures before they happened. There are some proposals and recommendations on the record already about how the Ombudsman's remit could be expanded, and I think this should be seriously considered. There was agreement by the committee that the landscape of both SPCB-supported bodies and public bodies in general in Scotland is messy. There are both gaps and overlaps in what organisations do and are responsible for. The whole landscape would benefit from some analysis and wider reconsideration to ensure that there is an effective network of public bodies to support advocacy and public trust, without duplication of or undermining the excellent work of third sector organisations who already do this work. It may be that the remit of an existing body can be adjusted, or that bodies can be consolidated. In the extraordinary case that a new body, intended to last in perpetuity, is to be created, it should absolutely be done following strict criteria, including that the proposed work cannot be done by anyone else, with or without a change of remit to an existing body.
Thank you, Ms Slater. We will now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 5 minutes. And I call Claire Hockey to be followed by Sue Webber. Ms Hockey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by thanking the committee for its work on this important issue and for this very comprehensive and detailed report. The ongoing requests from organisations and individuals in members' bills seeking to significantly increase the number of commissioners and thereby SPCB-supported bodies is one that has caused me great concern. So I could not agree more with the report's conclusions that any future proposals for new bodies and roles must satisfy the two-tier criteria of both justification and effectiveness tests. The landscape is, as we've already heard from others contributing to this debate, already complex, and many people are really unclear about the remits of the SPCB-supported bodies, how they can access and use their services, and what, if any, support they can offer individuals. And so I welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to a strategic mapping exercise to identify the functions of all Scottish public bodies and any overlap to fully inform decisions on future size, structure and coherence. In my role as convener of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee, I was recently involved in the recruitment process to appoint Scotland's first Patient Safety Commissioner. This, of course, was a role approved by this Parliament in the wake of the Cumberledge report. And amongst other functions attached to their role, they have powers to investigate healthcare safety issues, to amplify patients' voices, to report on safety issues and to make recommendations for how those should be addressed. And the newly appointed Commissioner will play a vital role as an independent public advocate for us all as NHS patients. And just yesterday, I was pleased to vote Stage 3 of the Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill in support of the establishment of a Victims and Witnesses Commissioner. If Parliament accepts the committee's recommendations that we're discussing today, then of course they would be adhered to in the establishment of that post. And of particular relevance are the recommendations around the requirements for a clear functional need for any role and a clearly defined remit. As we know, the establishment of the Victims and Witnesses Commissioner has strong stakeholder support, particularly for its ability to hold Scottish Government and criminal justice bodies to account. And its creation responds directly to calls for change from victims and bereaved families. And this is a key point and one which I have also been reflecting on in the light of the appointment of the new Patient Safety Commissioner that I mentioned earlier. All of us will have raised concerns on behalf of constituents about issues regarding healthcare, and the new Commissioner will play a vital role in advocating for systematic improvement in safety. But I do wonder how much the public currently knows about the new Commissioner's remit. Specifically, a shared understanding needs to be developed that the Patient Safety Commissioner will not undertake casework, complaints or advocacy on behalf of individuals or families. I'm sure that this new Commissioner's office, as it beds in, will have opportunities for public engagement and raising awareness about the bounds of their remit. But I do think that this is an example of how increasing the number of SCPB-supported bodies risks causing confusion and unnecessary complexity for people who are often experiencing a very difficult time in their lives and are seeking help and support and redress. With this in mind, I particularly welcome the recommendations at paragraph 150 in the committee's report about the need for simplicity and accessibility. These state that a body's purpose must be easily understandable to the public and that if it has a public-facing role, it must be designed to ensure both digital and physical accessibility so that people who require its services or support can engage with it promptly, effectively and without unnecessary barriers. And finally, Presiding Officer, I would like to welcome the committee's recommendations that in the next session of this Parliament there should be a committee with specific responsibility for scrutinising SPCB-supported bodies. We all know how busy our existing committees are and the level of demand that is placed on committee time with legislation, budget scrutiny and other inquiries. A dedicated committee with a remit to hold these bodies to account and to scrutinise their effectiveness or otherwise would have the time and scope to look in detail at the work they do. These supported bodies come at a significant cost to the public purse, and we need to be confident that their existence is justifiable, offers value for money, and that they are effectively improving lives and people's experiences of services. I'll close by again thanking the committee and the committee clerks for their work on this issue and commending the report, and I hope that their recommendations will gain cross-party support.
Thank you, Ms Hockey. I now call Sue Webber to be followed by Audrey Nicholl. Ms Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I first want to put on record that it was Liz Smith that was very much hoping to take part in this debate this afternoon, and I do hope that I can do some of her comments justice. I very much welcome this report and the engagement with MSPs on the part of Ben Macpherson and his colleagues. And I'm pleased to note that there's a very common theme within the committee's findings and those of the Finance Committee, which I think is an important reflection of where we are. And I remember giving evidence to the Finance Committee when I was the convener of the Education, Children and Young Persons Committee. And I think the most important thing about this entire debate is the context in which it is taking place. We need to recognise that the current structures have evolved over time and on an ad hoc basis, rather than through any coherent structure, which has clearly led to the questions we are facing around sustainability. And there are significant financial pressures on public finances. Then there are the concerns that the delivery of some of the public services have been seen as deficient, and we have heard about that today. And the Scottish Government's delay and indeed confusion in setting out exactly what parameters will drive much-needed public sector reform and on what basis they will be measured in terms of delivering better public services. And all of that context was important to the Finance Committee to help them better understand what it was that was driving the substantial increase in the number of proposals to create new SPCB-supported bodies, following a period of relative stability in the Commissioner landscape. As Mr Macpherson's committee acknowledges, just like Mr Gibson's committee, it is very clear from the evidence that the current model is no longer fit for purpose, as it lacks clarity and coherence, sufficient accountability and transparency over budget setting. And that combination is something which produces a very bad cocktail. It's bad for stakeholders and bad for the reputation of the Parliament. But as well as that recognition, the committee was clear that we need to look at what is mainly the advocacy type of commissioner, for which demand is increasing. And I agree with the Scottish Information Commissioner when he says that a lot of the desire for future commissioners is a bellwether to the lack of trust and confidence in a lot of public services. And Age Scotland, who commented that the SPCB-supported body model is an established way of getting more effective action on particular issues, especially as the model provided for more independence, in other words, implying that the best route might not always be via ministers, but clear that the current model is deficient when solving the problem, and the fact that government finds it far too easy to pass the buck for these failures. And I don't say this lightly, but on some matters today I do agree wholeheartedly with my colleague Lorna Slater. Committee members on more than one occasion felt compelled to ask witnesses how convenient it was when problems arose for government to think that the matter could be dealt with by a commissioner rather than by a minister. Would it not be better targeting money at the public service that's failing, rather than with a commissioner process? The report says that it found too much duplication within the system and too little awareness amongst the public about the role being played by each commissioner. Plus, some commissioners told the committee that they didn't really feel accountability to that matter, since they were seldom, if ever, called before committees to give evidence. That can't be right. Yes, I will give way, Mr Macpherson.
Very briefly, please, Macpherson.
As a previous convener of the Education Committee, would you agree with me that it actually, with so much legislation and other demands, it's quite difficult to fit in space for such scrutiny?
Sue Webber.
I agree with you, Mr Macpherson. I was fortunate as the Education Convener that we only had that one Commissioner coming, which did make it easier to programme that. But if there are many, it makes it even harder. And it can't be right, as I carry on, and it's just another reason why the current landscape isn't working very well. So, Presiding Officer, throughout this very welcome debate, there's been much food for thought, including about how well this Parliament operates when it comes to the disbursement of public money. And in order for us to take stock and think carefully about the way forward, that we will provide a more coherent and effective structure, we want to see a dedicated short-term committee examine the options, and while it does so, a moratorium is put in place. Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I would like to thank again Mr Macpherson and his committee.
Thank you, Ms Webber. I now call Audrey Nicholl to be followed by Richard Leonard. Ms Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I am also pleased to be able to speak in this debate this afternoon as convener of the Criminal Justice Committee. I should preface my remarks reflect my own perspective, but they do draw on the work of the committee. And I pay tribute to the detailed scrutiny undertaken by the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee, a really important and worthwhile piece of work. And I also pay tribute to the Finance and Public Administration Committee for its diligent work in this area. Indeed, I gave evidence to that committee during their review into the supported bodies landscape. So it is right that we review not only the number of commissioners, but other important factors, including costs, functions, shared services, governance and effectiveness. And I note the Review Committee's report outlines the anticipated drivers leading to a proliferation of supported bodies in place today. So I agree with the direction of travel in relation to new commissioners and the recommendation that a strategic mapping exercise be undertaken regarding functions, areas of overlap, and what the supported bodies landscape should look like in the future. All that said, I consider the Parliament's decision yesterday to create a new Victims and Witnesses Commissioner was the right one. When the Criminal Justice Committee considered that part of the Victims Bill, we did hear concerns that the cost of a new Commissioner could be put to better use elsewhere, or where an existing Commissioner could possibly take on that role. One witness told us that they would, and I quote, rather fund legal representation for survivors than a Commissioner. So would a Commissioner interfere with the ability of third sector organisations to engage directly with the Scottish Government and other justice bodies where strong relationships existed already? On balance, however, we supported the establishment of a Commissioner, caveated with a recommendation that the post should be time-limited to allow for its effectiveness to be reviewed. And I would also point out at this stage that the Criminal Justice Committee, at the time of our scrutiny, was unaware of the ministerial control framework. I don't think that's been referenced yet this afternoon when we were considering our proposals. I think that would have been a helpful framework to understand when we were scrutinising the case for a new Commissioner. In short, we wanted to see clear evidence that the post of a Commissioner has noticeably improved the experience of victims and witnesses, which is why we requested a review. The Scottish Biometrics Commissioner promotes the ethical and lawful use of biometric data in policing and criminal justice in Scotland, and the Police Investigation and Review Commissioner investigates incidents involving public bodies in Scotland. And I pay tribute to the work of both offices. They undertake highly specialist but different functions in the justice space, and in relation to the recommendation to adopt a two-tier approach to the establishment of new commissioners, I have no doubt whatsoever that both would pass the test, so to speak. I welcome this recommendation, and I also note the committee's view that standardising functions would risk constraining flexibility commissioners need. So turning to the issue of governance, an area of particular focus of the review, I think we are all agreed there is significant room for, indeed, a need for far more proactive scrutiny. And I acknowledge and agree with the view expressed by the Biometrics Commissioner, Dr Brian Plastow, when he told the Review Committee, and I quote, "It would be unrealistic to expect committees to respond to every report laid before Parliament." However, he suggested that a structured approach whereby each relevant committee holds a dedicated session once per year, for example, could strike a more manageable balance. And I agree with the findings and recommendations regarding the wider public bodies, and in the case of the justice sector, there may be scope to extend the Criminal Justice Committee scrutiny to other bodies such as inspectorates of prisons, policing and prosecution. So finally, I agree with the committee's recommendation that a new governance structure be introduced on a time-limited basis in the next parliamentary session. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I thank my colleague Ben Macpherson for leading this important review, and I look forward to following its delivering positive change across our supported bodies landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I now call Richard Leonard to be followed by George Adam. Mr Leonard.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start with an observation as a member of the committee? Because although small in number, albeit overinflated in title and big in scope, I strongly believe that it proved to be more effective than many parliamentary committees with over twice its size of membership. Can I also record that this model of short, sharp, time-limited committees, again, in my view, is also effective and is a model that's worth returning to. I describe the committee's purpose as being big in scope because this is not simply about whether there are shared back-office services between commissioners or how extensive the audit arrangements for them are. Neither should the debate today be reduced to considering how many commissioners and commissions there are or should be in the future. This committee report raises wider questions about how our democracy works, including, I have to say, how do we avoid an over-concentration of power in the hands of the executive? How do we prevent a marginalisation of Parliament as the people's guardian? But also, how do we stop an erosion of civil liberties of citizens' rights? So it is about perpetually upholding confidence and constantly rebuilding the people's trust in the political process, making sure that those who govern are accountable to those who are governed. So how we defend, therefore, not just the fabric, the resilience, the integrity of our democracy, but how do we defend democracy itself? And I do not say this lightly. Neither do I say it merely to address the fleeting challenges of the present, nor the world as we have come to know it, but to safeguard democratic rights in the future. Because, make no mistake, those on the right of politics, not just those in power across the Atlantic, but some seeking power here, who, if ever given the chance, would seek to hollow our democracy out, would seek to close debate and close challenge down, would seek to impose a form of authoritarianism in place of democracy. And so those institutions which we speak of in this debate today, I warn in the future, we Democrats will have to defend. Some of the evidence the committee took, I confess, took me a little bit by surprise. For example, the Scottish Information Commissioner told us that he was, in his own words, facing a never-ending cycle of constant audit. And he spoke of the disproportionality of the governance model, in which, in my view, he failed to recognise that these are about assurance and accountability, and failed to recognise that, in the end, he and other commissioners and the bodies which the committee reviewed are spending public money. And I am bound to refer him and any elected members of this Parliament who also think that we are over-audited to the recent case of the Water Industry Commission for Scotland. I was also a little bit surprised as well by some of the remarks of the Minister, who told us, I thought rather dismissively, that, I quote, "a commissioner is one voice amongst several." Although this is a Minister for Public Finance who told Parliament just last week that he didn't think it was a matter for him that the GFG Alliance has not submitted audited accounts for years and was the subject of a serious fraud office investigation. But then, just to be even-handed, there was the now departed... Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Briefly, Minister.
Just to be clear, the point I was making was that obviously as government we wouldn't comment on an investigation that was underway by the Serious Fraud Office.
Richard Leonard.
I think you said that company law was reserved and therefore you weren't prepared to comment on the lodging of audited accounts or not. Anyway, that's on the record. And can I just be even-handed, though, because we also spoke to the now departed Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, who, I have to say to my bewilderment, told me that she would not want, I quote, true enforcement powers, just at the very point the Labour government was openly defying the recommendations of the Health and Parliamentary Ombudsman at Westminster on the award of compensation to the WASPI women after it found the Department of Work and Pensions guilty of maladministration. So I'm not here making a narrow party political point. These are matters which go to the very heart of what we're debating and where powers rest and whether powers of enforcement exist. So in closing, it's important, I think, to underline that the committee believed that we should consider empowering the Scottish Human Rights Commission with powers of litigation, giving new scope for more strategic powers to the Scottish Public Sector Ombudsman, and widening and deepening the powers of the Children and Young People's Commissioner. It was a privilege to serve on this committee. I hope that our findings do make a difference, that they will not gather dust, but contribute to the battle for effective scrutiny, accountability, and the battle for the very soul of democracy itself.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. And I call George Adam to be followed by John Mason. Mr Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I come at this debate from a specific role. The many roles that I've held within this Parliament, from backbencher to Chief Whip to Minister for Parliamentary Business and then back to backbencher again. And been on nearly just about every committee in this Parliament at one point during my time here. So, in fact, that specific role has been such that Martin Whitfield has been trying to get me in a free transfer to the Standards Committee for some time so he can get into these particular set of skills that I seem to have. But for me, this debate gives us a chance to take a serious look at Scotland's Commissioner landscape and to ask if we are getting best value for the people we represent and the representation that they need. And the committee has completed some really good work on this issue and given us a chance to look at this for the best way forward. And during my time as a minister, I worked with two information commissioners. I know, although they were both very different people, they were both very good at the work to work with and doing the work that they did. So none of what I'm about to say has anything to do with any of the commissioners and the work that they do. It's more about how we can do this work better. And the committee is clear when they say we need a stronger criteria for creating new commissioners. We can't continue to add another commissioner every single time there's a flashpoint or a challenging situation. The report in paragraph 142 calls for a mapping of all our public bodies, and that is happening through our public service reform strategy. This should show us where functions overlap and where we can streamline, and it should be about coherence and not about clutter. And this is what I want to talk about, Presiding Officer. Let's look at our Nordic neighbours, Finland, Denmark, Norway. I think it's been mentioned already today. They don't scatter powers across a dozen wee offices all over the country. They have big, broad remit ombudsmen. In Finland, the Parliamentary Ombudsman covers complaints, detention, monitoring and even human rights oversight. New Zealand, the Ombudsman handles FOI as well as making sure that there's maladministration. These offer fewer institutions, bigger remits and clarity for citizens. Does this type of model cost less? Presiding Officer, not always, but it can deliver economies of scale and avoid duplication, and it gives them the status that truly take on government and public services effectively. It's about creating the most effective and coherent system we possibly can, and the committee's report in paragraph 165 points to the better use of public estate. Again, we have half a dozen wee offices when we can have a larger, efficient one. Let's go over it again. Finland, one big parliamentary ombudsman that covers so much. New Zealand, their ombudsman covers is the equivalent of 3 Scottish commissioners. I might even go further and look at the idea of an officer of commissioners, all under one roof, with shared administrative and back-of-house support. This would provide the efficiencies through the use of administrative functions. A united office can ensure common standards and reports and joint strategic focus. How it's structured could be something we could discuss on another day, because I don't think I'd have the time to discuss about that. But perhaps we could look at a chief Commissioner and others reporting to them. Perhaps I should leave it at that for this stage today. But it's important that we look at these different ideas that could be out there, because if you look at some of the Nordic countries in particular, very similar population to what we have, but at the same time they have an awful lot less commissioners. So what are they doing right that we're not currently doing, and what are they delivering for the people and their citizens that we're not doing here as well? And it cuts down the confusion that many people have as to who they would actually go and report to. So, Presiding Officer, the message is clear. Scotland does need commissioners, but it doesn't need more clutter. We need a system that is leaner, clearer and stronger. And I, for one, are quite happy to actually work and talk with anyone who wants to look at doing this type of work, because I think that's what will make the difference as we take this forward.
Thank you, Mr Adam. And I call John Mason. Mr Mason.
Thank you. That was certainly one of George Adams' better speeches, and he didn't mention Paisley once, as far as I could see. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm a member of the Finance Committee, which looked at this topic previously, and I've read the recent review committee's report with interest. Broadly speaking, I'm supportive of what the committee is recommending, although I do feel they could have been a little bit more radical. It is not that commissioners are a bad thing, but Scotland is a small country, as we've just heard, with a very cluttered public body landscape. We should be able to do things in a much simpler way compared to other larger countries. That's why I have high hopes for Ivan McKee's work on public sector reform, and I hope he will be cutting down on the number of public bodies in a major way. While financial savings from fewer commissioners will not exactly transform the NHS, I think restricting the numbers of SPCB-supported bodies does send out an important signal that we need a simpler landscape. Every commissioner we agree to diverts resources away from frontline services. And as the Finance Committee found, and has now been confirmed, setting up a new commissioner was fast becoming a way for both government and individual MSPs to try to show that they were tackling a problem. And very often the underlying problem is actually a lack of money or resources. So having a commissioner does not really solve that problem. What it might do is push one group further up the queue and push other groups further down. But I fear that does not take us any further forward as a whole. Coming to the committee report, I very much welcome the proposal for both justification and effectiveness tests, specifically the idea of it being the last resort, and also that there must be a clear functional gap before we set up a new commissioner. I have to say I'm less convinced on the point of independence, as I do think we can have independence without separate legal bodies. And we have examples like the Inspector of Constabulary and the Inspector of Prisons, which are not set up as legal distinct organisations, but which I think are respected as independent. So I very much welcome this report and will vote for the motion tonight. Personally, I would have stopped all new commissioners, including the new Patient Safety Commissioner and the Victims and Witnesses Commissioner, which somewhat ironically we only agreed to yesterday. However, I accept that the overall mood is that we already have made a commitment on these and Parliament wants to go ahead with them. It was interesting to read the comments of the Ombudsman that if the SPSO had been given slightly wider powers, the Patient Safety Commissioner would not really have been needed. And I also still think there are strong arguments for merging the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life and the Standards Commission. If one of the tests is for the public to understand the different commissioners, then this is one where I do not think the public understands, and frankly, I don't think I do either. Concerning the Scottish Human Rights Commission, I have to say that I had a lot of sympathy for the idea we heard at Finance Committee of rapporteurs within the SHRC, and maybe that's a bit similar to what George Adam was talking about just now. But I note that the Review Committee rejects that. However, I do think that their suggestion of the SHRC having a different emphasis each year, following the example of the Auditor-General, is potentially a good one. The SHRC's own briefing for today's debate confirms that they are open to their powers and remit being reviewed. On the other hand, I am less convinced about the need for a specialist committee to scrutinise all SPCB-supported bodies, even though this is planned to be just a pilot. I do think there is a danger of duplication in this regard. Individual committees should be carrying out this scrutiny role, and I know that some already are. For example, the Children and Young People's Commissioner, in their briefing, stressed the importance of their regular interaction with the Education, Children and Young People Committee, so they would potentially be dealing with 3 committees. The SHRC commented that their committee did hold them to account, but did not deal with finance and budget scrutiny. And I'm sorry, but I do think that subject committees need to do more on finance and not leave all of that to the Finance Committee. So overall, I'm happy to support the committee's motion tonight. I think that they could have gone a little bit further and been a little bit more radical. However, at least we are putting down a clear marker that the drift to having more and more commissioners must be stopped, and that is very much welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. We now move to closing speeches. I call on Lawrence Slater to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 5 minutes, please.
There were some other points of evidence that were taken by the committee that I think there is value in highlighting to this chamber. One of these was about the connection between Parliament and the existing SPCB-supported bodies, and indeed between Parliament and public bodies in general. There are improvements to be had, both in how well parliamentary committees were holding these bodies to account and how effectively the work of these bodies is being fed into Parliament and to government. In many cases, commissioners and other bodies are doing excellent work, research, producing reports, and they aren't necessarily being taken up by or feeding into government policy or priorities. This may be exacerbated when bodies are working on matters which don't align with the current legislation and policies that the government is focusing on. So reports aren't immediately relevant to the work of government and therefore languish on a shelf. Some alignment of what commissioners and public bodies are doing with the current government programme may be beneficial. Some of the issue appears to be a lack of effective mechanism to feed this work into Parliament. Parliamentary committees choose the work that they will undertake, and if they choose not to delve into and look into detail at the work of SPCB-supported bodies or commissioners or other public bodies, their work may just be ignored. This is why I support the formation of a committee specifically to bring the work of SPCB-supported bodies into Parliament. The Audit Committee provided the example for this, where the work of Audit Scotland is considered weekly, and that committee can bring issues raised to the attention of Parliament, to the attention of government, and to the subject matter committees. I think that there is something else about ensuring that the subject committees are clear about their role in scrutinising the work of public bodies. They can choose to prioritise this. And they can also choose to use the influence and investigations done by these bodies to influence government and hold government to account. They can be the link. I was concerned to hear that the creation of each new advocacy commissioner reduces the remit of the Human Rights Commissioner. This seems to me to be the wrong direction of travel. Expanding the remit and resources of the Human Rights Commissioner, possibly with the addition of focused time-limited projects, as suggested by Maggie Chapman, may provide a better solution than a proliferation of new commissioners. An interesting finding of the committee was around the independence of public bodies. It was emphasised to us how important it was for the SPCB-supported bodies to be independent of government, something we can all agree on. But we also heard from and about other bodies in the wider public sector landscape who act independently from government, such as the Scottish Fiscal Commission, Audit Scotland, and the Scottish Legal Complaints Commission. In short, it is not necessary for commissioners to be supported by the SPCB for them to be independent of government, or for them to work in the space of supporting public trust. I could certainly discern no pattern with respect to what public bodies should be SPCB supported and which should be ordinary public bodies. I'm sure that everyone in this chamber would like to prevent failure in our public services delivery and to quickly and effectively address failures when they do occur. We all want to ensure that public services are effective for everyone. I don't think that a proliferation of commissioners is an effective mechanism for this. Instead, I think we need to reconsider the remit of our existing public bodies, including, as Jordan Adam has said, the possible consolidation of these bodies, filling gaps where they exist between bodies to ensure full coverage of public trust mechanisms and service delivery oversight, ensuring clarity of responsibility and putting in place systems to prevent delivery failures rather than just reacting to them. The evidence pointed very clearly to our roles as parliamentarians. It is our job to raise issues with ministers. Our jobs on committees to follow what public bodies are doing and to feed their work into this Parliament and to government. We can't outsource this. It's our role. And there is something here for each of us to consider about how we may be most effective as well.
Thank you, Ms Slater. I now call on Martin Whitfield to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 5 minutes, please.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer, and it is a pleasure to speak in this debate. Now, and again, as others have done, absolutely start by thanking the convener, the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee, its members and those that supported it, along with, of course, the commissioners themselves who contributed so much to it. And at the outset, I want to say that I support the recommendations of the report. It's timely, it's a necessary intervention into a system that's basically grown without strategy coherence or indeed sufficient scrutiny, as we've heard this afternoon. And the report rightly identifies that Scotland's commissioner landscape has evolved in an ad hoc manner, and we have a patchwork of bodies, some of them statutory regulators, some of them advocacy-focused, and some attempting to do both. And this lack of clarity has led to duplication, inefficiency and confusion. And it's just within the Parliament, but among the public that we serve, that this confusion exists. But let me also be clear that commissioners are an essential to our democracy, but we need to understand their roles. The statutory commissioners, such as the Scottish Information Commissioner or the Ethical Standards Commissioner, regulators, enforcers of laws, upholders of standards and insurance of compliance. The advocacy commissioners that amplify the voices of the under or unrepresented and promote systemic change. And then there are those that straddle both, that are expected to advocate, expected to investigate and expect, in some cases, also to regulate, often without the resources or the clarity to do so effectively. And there have been some fascinating contributions, and I want to start with George Adams, simply because of his invite to me to continue to petition for his transfer and an expansion of my committee, obviously. But I think the comment that he rightly made over the coherence over clutter is massively important, as is having the status to take on government, because a number of contributions have pointed out, and I think most clearly expressed by Lorna Slater, that we create commissioners that the Scottish Government won't listen to. And that's the challenge. But I put back, is that the fault of the Commissioner? Is that the fault of cross-party groups? Is that the fault of committees? Is that the fault of individuals out there if the Scottish Government choose not to listen?
Lorna Slater.
I mean, the member raises a very good point, and I think it's a frustration that we have, and we can use the example of climate matters, which Sarah Boyack also raised, which is creating a new commissioner just gives the government another group to ignore. It doesn't necessarily have more clout or more effectiveness, and there are other bodies, international bodies as well as third sector organisations, who have the ability to do research. So it isn't that a commissioner is suddenly going to make the government jump into action. So I think there is a better question there about how, for example, parliamentary committees can be more effective in influencing government.
Martin Whitfield.
Absolutely. I welcome that intervention because this sits within a complex network or jigsaw of which there is work going on that will come before this chamber, before the end of this session. And I want to deal with the question of the motion that has so upset colleagues across the chamber. So for the upset, can I apologise for that? But let me pick out the reason for it. And I will ensure that I give time, in particular, for the SPCB to respond back to what Maggie Chapman was saying about the disadvantage of losing a direct specific order from this chamber. But the motion opens rightly pointing out the challenge of creating the resource on our committees, and yet the specifics draw attention for the creation of additional committees. I understand and in fact agree with the proposal for a temporary attempt to give one committee the responsibility for all commissioners. Of course, we'll then have to explore where in their statutory functions some of the commissioners are going to report to. Is the Ethical Standards Commissioner working satisfactorily if there is X number of complaints that are processed through? And will the committee want to look at those? Because we sit within both primary and standing orders legislation with regard to how that's dealt with. And it is a complex question, which is why I raised the question with the SPCB contribution about giving evidence to a parliamentary committee. There is a challenge in those roles, and I think that challenge needs to be considered and needs to be considered carefully. I am conscious of time, Deputy President. I'm grateful.
Well, very briefly, because Mr Whitfield will now thereafter be concluding.
Thank you, President.
Maggie Chapman.
I wonder whether Martin Whitfield will acknowledge, though, that if a committee required to take evidence, it would be possible to do so in camera, so that some of the frank conversations that already exist between commissioners and corporate body, which meets in camera, could still happen.
Martin Whitfield, and please start to conclude.
Given the shortage of time, I'm more than happy to discuss that. I'm challenged by that we're going to hide this behind a camera being off. So, in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I did just want to mention the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner, because Derek Walker, the Commissioner, has said, being the guardian of the interests of people not yet born is the greatest privilege. And one of the roles that commissioners have taken is giving a voice to those people who don't have a voice in this place. I'm grateful.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. I now call on Stephen Kerr to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just reflect on the fact that this has been a very useful debate, and many of the speeches that have been given have been very thoughtful. Members have clearly thought through the implications of this excellent report, and their conclusions and their thoughts have been much appreciated by me. It's been very difficult in a few minutes to be able to sum up everything that members have said, but I do want to congratulate Ben McPherson and his committee on producing such a fine report. And I thought Ben McPherson struck a number of different significant notes in his opening comments, specifically around the importance of a strategic mapping exercise, which was immediately taken up by the Minister in relation to these particular bodies, but I think there's a wider exercise to be done in terms of the wider public sector and bodies, and I know that the Minister is across that. But I also thought it was significant that he talked about parliamentary capacity, because this is a subject that we have debated on a Thursday afternoon before, and I don't feel that we're making very much progress in actually tackling it. And that is when you look at the scale of the work of scrutinising that falls upon this Parliament. We have 129 members. In addition to the bodies that we've been discussing this afternoon, Focus, there are 131 public bodies. Now, that's more than one body per MSP. So the scale of the task of proper scrutiny, frankly, means that when you see the sprawling network of commissions and commissioners and ombudsmen and all these different public bodies, and I think it was interesting that I have this great quote from Ivan McKee, which he knows that I will use on every possible occasion I can. The Minister said on one occasion, nobody knows everything about all the 130-odd public bodies and what they're all doing. I mean, that says it all for me. That does kind of sum up where we are in context. If the Minister feels this way, then I think every other member in this Parliament should feel the same way, and we should resolve on the basis of some of the very good formed thought that we've heard this afternoon to actually do something about it. Or will we simply say, oh, this debate and this report is part of some legacy from this session of Parliament that someone else, whoever's sitting in these places in a few months' time, is going to have to pick up and do something with? And I think that would be an abrogation of responsibility. So in the time we've got left, and I know that we have a lot on our plates, we should do something about this. Kenny Gibson highlighted, and he often does, when we're not... See, it's very interesting, and Murdo Fraser talked about this, that when we take off these party hats and these rosette colours, and we begin to talk to each other about how we can make our country better, how we can improve its governance, how we can improve this Parliament, how we can improve the processes that we use, it's incredible to discover that regardless of the party, we end up largely agreeing with each other. There's a lesson in this. It's not what the public see, and it's not what the public perceive. But when we set aside the biggest issue that divides us, we actually find a huge element of common ground. And that's why I'm astonished. I astonish myself by reflecting on the fact that probably two of the best speeches that have been given today were given by Lorna Slater. Now, that's probably going to result in two things. One is I will be excommunicated from the Conservative and Unionist Party, and the other is that her status in the Green Party, already somewhat shaky, may indeed be shakier. So I'm being extremely nice to the member, and I'm sorry that she doesn't feel that I am. But I thought that her speech, along with Kenny Gibson's, just, hits the nail on the head. In terms of the quality of work, the quantity of work, the need for deadlines, the need for a clear process, all of it, all the things that Kenny Gibson said about that, I 100% endorse. I wish that would become the culture of our Parliament. And when Lorna Slater says what we need is not all these different bodies and all these different places to go, these signposts to different people, what we need is a Parliament that does its job. And in fact, if the Parliament were to begin to exercise its parliamentary muscles and properly scrutinise and hold the executive to account, the good news for the executive is that they would improve. And by the measurement of many of us in this chamber, they need to improve. And partly the consequence of the performance of any government is the ability of the Parliament that they account to do its job. And on that scale, on that measurement, we don't do a particularly good job. And that's what we keep coming back to. So when Lorna Slater quotes the example of the New Zealand witness before this committee's inquiry, I think we should sit up and take note. We need a Parliament that does its job. Now, I'm recognising I'm quickly running out of time. There were some really good things said by a number of people. I'm going to focus, if I might, a little on what Richard Leonard said, my old sparring partner from decades ago at University of Stirling, because he also reflects on the fact that when we get together in small committees, and I think there's something here that needs to be underlined and capitalised, that when we get together in small committees and we have these short, sharp, time-limited inquiries, we get really good work. I hope that that lesson is not lost on any of us, because I think it's a very important lesson he shared. And when he talks about the need for accountability, I say hear, hear, and amen. Because he quoted one example, the famous water example, but I would quote the example of the City of Glasgow officials that awarded themselves huge payoffs. To whom do they account? To whom do they account at the end of the day? We have a system that's lacking in accountability. Democratic accountability. So what he said in his characteristic fashion is absolutely correct. Well, look, I think I'm out of time. John Mason said that George Adam had given one of his best speeches without mentioning Paisley. But I actually think that John Mason gave one of his best speeches, because I agree with him. We don't need more bodies, we need less. We need better processes of accountability. We need a change of culture in our public services generally, regardless of the body we look at. We need a zero defects approach.
Mr Kerr, could you please bring your remarks to close? Thank you.
A zero defects approach, so that we can improve what we do in the name of the people of Scotland for the people of Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call on Minister Ivan McKee to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I have to say, it's turned out to be a very interesting debate and a huge amount of agreement across the chamber. And actually, I think the only disagreement has been around about the Labour amendment, which, for the record, we won't be supporting. We've seen Sue Webber make common cause with Lorna Slater, Stephen Kerr with Richard Leonard. It's quite a remarkable afternoon, it has to be said. I'd like to commend Ben McPherson and indeed Murdo Fraser for setting out very well the issues that were addressed by the committee. And Murdo Fraser was right in making the point that there is a limitless potential for the creation of new commissioners, should we choose to do so. So it was very important that this issue was addressed. And Lorna Slater made the point that often this is seen as a perceived response to public services. Now, as a Government Minister, I will argue that services are, of course, good and improving. And not everyone will share that view, of course. But the key point is that whatever your view of public services, the answer isn't to make the system more complicated. That just makes services worse, not better. It diverts resource and attention, a point that was made very well by Kenny Gibson. And just for the record, reflecting on a point Lorna Slater made in her intervention, the Government doesn't ignore anyone. We listen to all voices and respond to them appropriately. Moving on to talk, reflect on some of the comments from Stephen Kerr. I think, in fairness, the point he makes about no one knows what every public body is doing is in terms of their detailed work plans, because not everyone knows what every public body is doing at a detailed level. Of course that's the case, but that was just to reflect the complexity of the system we have in front of us and the number of challenges seeking to address. We are taking forward that work to continue to review the overlaps and duplication, to address that through that mapping exercise as part of the simplification process. And I'll talk more in a minute about the broader PSR strategy. But in response to Stephen Kerr's other point, the work that has been the excellent report that's been produced by this committee, he has to look at in the broader context of the PSR strategy, which I'm sure he's read from cover to cover, all 18 work streams, and he's across that, because that is the vehicle that will take forward the activity across that broad front, engaging not just government and public bodies, but those right across the broader public sector, third sector and other voices, to make sure that we deliver on that aspiration to build a more effective public service delivery mechanism. Indeed, yeah.
Stephen Kerr.
That in terms of culture change, that there should be a line in every annual budget for every cost centre in government that is measurable productivity savings.
Minister.
We are working to take forward the productivity improvements. As the member knows, the culture point is really important. He'll know that work stream 1 in the PSR strategy addresses culture. We absolutely understand that, and we tie that very closely to how we recruit, promote, assess and hold accountable leaders across the public sector. And the work we're doing on preventative budgets in work stream 6 is really important as well, to be able to make sure that exactly what he's talking about, every public pound that we spend, we're clear on how we're getting value from that. I thought Richard Leonard's comments were interesting, further broadening out the scope and importance of what we're trying to do today. We clearly don't see eye to eye on everything from the comments he made, but I do absolutely take on board the points he makes about holding the executive to account. It's absolutely critical in our democracy, and Stephen Kerr made the point that actually makes the job of the executive easier in some extent, because we do have that very constructive challenge, which is helpful in enabling us to take forward the important work that we do on behalf of the people that send us here. The comments Richard Leonard made on how getting this right is important for our democracy more broadly, I think is worth reflecting on. I think turning to the work that the government is doing in this regard, because I think we all recognise, and John Mason made this point very well, that yes, we're talking about £18 million here, we're talking about a handful of commissioners, but the signal it sends and the approach and culture change it signifies is important. The public service reform agenda is about shifting those resources to the front line. It is about making a significant difference to the lives of the people of Scotland by doing so, and positively impacting that service delivery. It is about further integration of services and shifting resources to prevention, which we believe can make billions of pounds of impact across public services. The direction of travel today, we've been talking about not increasing the number of commissioners and indeed public bodies. The direction of travel, and again Stephen Kerr made this point and John Mason as well, is to reduce, not increase, the number of public bodies. We don't want to end up in a situation where the only show in town is restructuring, because that of itself can be diversionary. We'll take the work forward through removal of duplication and integration and shared services, but be very clear, and the strategy is very clear on this, where necessary structural change will be implemented appropriately to reduce the number of public bodies, to make sure that the services we deliver on behalf of the people of Scotland are as integrated, effective and efficient as possible. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. That was unexpected. I had a very immediate impact on the Minister, though, so that's something to bear in mind in the future, perhaps. I now call on Ben McPherson, on behalf of the SPCB supported bodies Landscape Review Committee, to wind up the debate. If you take us to 5:20, that would be great, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I'm very pleased to close this debate, which I think has been an excellent one, and showing our Parliament at its best in terms of constructive dialogue, different reflections and putting forward perspectives on these issues of concern that we share. and to do so to close on behalf of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee, and thank everyone who has contributed to today's debate for their reflections and their time, and also again to my fellow committee members. Our small but really effective committee delivered for the Parliament in terms of this report, and really brilliantly supported by our clerks and the research team at SPICE. So thanks again. As I said, we've heard a range of reflections this afternoon, many of which have touched on themes and challenges that our committee grappled with over the course of our 6-month review. And I will pick up on a number of points now. It was really helpful, first of all, for Maggie Chapman and Kenny Gibson to set the perspectives of the SPCB and the FPAC committee in terms of the research that had happened prior to our committee's work being instructed, and also the SPCB's wider challenges and procedures in terms of engaging with the bodies, and the way that this report can assist the SPCB going forward if it is agreed by Parliament. Also grateful to the Minister for setting out the perspective of the Government and touching more widely on public sector reform. And one of the challenges we faced as a committee was considering the SPCB supported bodies as part of a much wider landscape of public sector bodies, and the need for consideration of reform across the board. And it's helpful that the Government have engaged so constructively with our committee's recommendations, because, as Claire Hockey rightly emphasised, we need to get to a position of greater simplicity and accessibility. As George Adam emphasised, we need to move to a position of a more streamlined situation with greater coherence. And as John Mason emphasised, that there is potential for amalgamation and reducing the amount of public bodies. And it will be very interesting and important to see how the Government takes forward its agenda. And I know Parliament will be looking at that with great detail and attention. In terms of some of the points that were raised, I think that Martin Whitfield was right to emphasise the fact that the reporting on committees has been enhanced as of yesterday and was already substantial. And we heard from Sue Webber and Audrey Nicholl in previous and current convener capacities how difficult it is for some committees, particularly the large committees with the amount of legislation that they're already having to contend with, to scrutinise regularly and effectively our public bodies. And that is why the committee made its recommendations for a specifically dedicated committee to look at these issues. I understand Martin Whitfield wants to come in.
I'm very grateful. And did the committee consider what I fear may come up in the future, although I absolutely agree that it's worth trying, that the independent committee, say, lacks the specialism of, say, the Children's and Young Persons Committee to deal with the specialism of the commissioners in front of them?
Ben Macpherson.
At no point did our committee recommend or decide that the specific committee would be the only committee that would hold the bodies to account. It's about providing additional accountability and driving proactivity and performance, and therefore public sector delivery improvement that is the aspiration of our recommendations. To move to two speeches which, and I'm not just saying this because they were my colleagues on the committee, I thought Lorna Slater and Richard Leonard's speeches were both outstanding and symbolic of the contributions that they made in our committee and being excellent colleagues. And I thought that they touched on 2 points that were related to the fact that, as outlined in the opening of the debate, while our report has recommended targeted improvements across the board, it has specifically done this in terms of improvements to how SPCB supported body the landscape could, and indeed the wider public sector could operate, and that this could involve changes to the existing bodies. So, as Richard Leonard touched on, we recommend enhancing the powers of the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman based on the evidence we received, and the committee recommends that the SPSO be granted enhanced powers to carry out own initiative investigations in the public interest. This would enable the Ombudsman to identify and report on systematic failures within public services before complaints arise, and it would be a preventative measure that we believe would better deliver outcomes for service users and provide greater value for public money in the long run. And the committee welcomes the Scottish Government's commitment to engage with the SPCB on this recommendation. And as Lorna Slater touched on, we also considered how the Scottish Human Rights Commission could be developed to provide a more effective rights-based approach to addressing structural inequalities in Scotland. And while we were not convinced that expanding the functions of the SHRC to include specialist departments, rapporteurs or sub-commissioners to protect specific groups of society would achieve the best outcomes, we do believe there is a case for a wider review of the remit and powers of the SHRC. And once again, the committee welcomes the Scottish Government's commitment to hold further discussions with the SPCB and the SHRC on this matter and the engagement we've had from the SHRC. And thirdly, the committee believes that the SPCB supported bodies could do more to adopt a more proactive and preventative approach. Our recommendations encourage each SPCB supported body to put in place measures that would allow them to address systematic issues at an early stage. The shift towards a more proactive and preventative approach would not only enhance the effectiveness of these bodies, but it would also help avoid issues such as complaints or service delivery failures arising in the first place. And just on that, of course, there will be considerations in future meetings of Parliament about the SPCB supported bodies, but it may be worth considering that the Children's Commissioner is naturally a commissioner that thinks about future generations, and perhaps there is some thought that could be provided there on if its remit in future could be reconsidered. Just a point of constructive engagement with Sarah Boyack. The issue of shared services, we recognise, is something where progress has been made, but more could be done. We recommend moving towards a formal hub and spoke model, centralising key support functions such as HR, finance and IT, while ensuring the statutory independence of each office holder is protected. And in addition, we encourage greater and more flexible use of the wider public sector estate as existing leases come to an end, striking the right balance between efficiency and independence. We encourage the Scottish Government and the SPCB to work together to achieve this. Presiding Officer, this has been a good constructive debate, and this review has been an opportunity to look at the bigger picture of how we create, support and scrutinise SPCB supported bodies that play a vital role in safeguarding public trust and institutional integrity and democratic accountability. Our recommendations are designed to future-proof that landscape, ensuring it's strategic, sustainable and fit for the years ahead. And we therefore call on all members to support the committee's motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Macpherson. That concludes the debate on behalf of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee on SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review. And we now move on to the next item of business, and the Chamber will wish to know that there are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. I can confirm that the first question is that Amendment 18936.1 in the name of Martin Whitfield, which seeks to amend Motion 18936 in the name of Ben Macpherson on behalf of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee on SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access digital voting.